Hey everybody, today we're going to be talking about buying land and ranch here in the state of Texas, the basics, the things that you need to know when you're sitting down and starting out your plan. Now, this is what you're looking for? Stick around, we're going to get started right now. Hey, I'm Kerry Fletcher with Mims Group, right here in the great state of Texas. If you or your family are considering buying land and ranch, or interested in what is it like to eat, sleep, drink, live that land and ranch lifestyle, no matter if it's hunting, fishing, buying some cows, horses, or just a weekend getaway, this is the channel for you. Why don't you go ahead and hit that subscribe button, ring that bell, and that way you're notified as we put out videos every week. Hey, and when you guys get ready to make that decision and you're ready to move forward, just give us a call, send us an email, send us a text message. Hey, if you want to, just send us a note via Pony Express. Any which way, when you're buying land and ranch here in the state of Texas, we've got your back. Now, the basics, the 101. This is going to sound a little bit intuitive, like duh, of course, but you would be surprised how many people I know, how many people I've worked with that miss and skip this first step. And this first step is have a plan, have a design, have a purpose for what you want. Is this going to be a weekend getaway? Is this going to be a complete change in lifestyle? Is this going to be a hunting place predominantly for multi-generations? Is this going to be a farm? Is this something that you're going to want to subdivide later for further generations? But really sitting down and figuring out that purpose, that use for the land is the most important thing. And I'll tell you a story. Good friends of ours, they spent 2-3 years just looking all over the state of Texas trying to figure out what they wanted. And predominantly, it was because they didn't take the time or didn't really have those good, tough conversations about what is it that we're looking for, what do we want to see with the end vision here. The second is going to be size. Size is super important. If you caught any of the video that my parents did, they did this for 30 plus years, and we put together some testimonials of the pros and cons. They had big places, small places, and they currently have about 60 acres. Well, because it's 60 acres, because of that size, and because of how it's conditioned, it's not a full-time job, but it's certainly something that they have to live there, be there. It's they called it never-ending acres, right? There's always some sort of maintenance, upkeep, things that they need to do. Whereas if you're looking for more of a weekend place, well, then you might want something more along the lines of 5 or 10 acres. But size is super important. You need to look into what are the restrictions on hunting off size. What are the restrictions on, and we're going to get to this later, different tax implications, because whether you qualify for ag exemption or not. So figuring out and scoping that size is, the next step that derives from what is your ultimate goal or your ultimate purpose. So number 3, or the third one, is topography. So if you're going to be looking for farmland, well, you're going to want flat, drainable topography with very little trees, things that you can come in there that call it that river bottom, black land dirt that you can come in and plow and plant and irrigate and have no flood plains in it and good drainage. If you're going to want a hunting ground or a hunting area, well, you're going to want to have rolling hills. You're going to want to have a lot of vegetation, and you're going to want a lot of mixing it up within the topography. If you're looking for a ranch, you're going to want that kind of that in between. You're going to want to be able to have pasture lands, but still at the same time have some trees, some vegetation, some coverage. and access to water and or water rights. And we're going to get to water and water rights here towards the end. So easements. How can you access or get to the property? So not every property out there is bordered by a county maintained road, right? Lots of them you have to have easements, or you have to cross other people's property to get to them. You need to be sure that if that's the case, that easement or that access is deeded, i.e. you have a legal right or a legal claim to the privately maintained road and the privately maintained area, so that you can have access, and that deeded easement is able to be sold, able to be passed on. Now, easements. Let's also talk about one thing that's super important to the value of the land is, does somebody else already have an easement on the property that you're looking at? And sometimes it's not obvious or intuitive, but there could be oil and gas pipeline easements. There could be water pipelines easements. There could be an existing oil well on someone else's, or natural gas well on someone else's property, that your property is burdened by having an easement and access, and you think it's this nothing road and it's gate, and you don't think of much of it, but one day this big I'm not going to call it an 18-wheeler, but an 18-wheeler comes up to your gate, unlocks your fence, drives across your property to go pick up oil or natural gas on the property next to you. So easements and access ways are super important. And forgive me for checking my notes every once in a while. I can't remember all these just off the top of my head. Amenities. Do you want to build your own house? Do you want to build your own barn? Do you want to build your own fences? Or do you want to go to a place that has those, right? So the value of the land is very much driven by the types of amenities that it has. Everything from, is it cleared of like cedar brush, and is it cleared of mesquite trees, which are nuisance trees that suck up the water and really restrict the water for grasses or other post oaks or other trees that you want to have that are going to feed your deer population or your other wildlife population. So that is an amenity. Another amenity, fences. If you're doing some sort of ranchette, if you call it, a little bit of a farm where you're raising some hay and a little bit of some cattle, then not only are you going to want good border fencing around your property, but you're going to want to have cross fencing such that you can keep the cows out away from the hay fields, and you can keep rotate them around between raising hay and grazing. Other amenities are water. So we're going to get to, like I said, water rights here towards the end, mineral rights, but another amenity is stock tanks. For those of you who aren't familiar with Texas and Texas land and ranch, Texas is not a place that has a lot of naturally formed what's called ponds or places where water pools for horses, deer, cattle. And so since the 1800s, people have been building these man-made ponds, and they're called tanks. If you're ever out roaming around, you'll hear everybody use the term tank. It's a short derivative of stock tanks. That's another amenity. Barns, fences, holding pens, sorting pens are other amenities. And then of course there's the whole decision of, do you want to buy one that has a house on it, or do you want to build your own on it? And again, that goes back to the plan of, do you just want to go out there and stay temporarily, or do you want to go out there and live, and do you want to do it yourself? And I really encourage you to check out the pros and cons. Hear a couple of stories of where my mom and dad built their own home a couple of times over. Property values widely varied depending upon the use or the purpose. Land that's the best use for it or the most economically viable use for it is commercial development. It may be like 100 acres out in this great area, but when you take a look at it, because of its access to highways or urban growth, the best case use for that might be commercial development where somebody buys the 100, 200 acres and puts in warehouses or something on it. So that's going to really drive the price up versus, commercial development would be the highest price. Residential development, the second. Somebody buys a bunch of acreage, turns it into a subdivision. The next use case would be high value farmland, something that's got good irrigation, good water, not in a flood zone, that can make a lot of money. And then you start getting into what more people consider these mixed uses, these lands that have don't have the topography or the roads to do either commercial, residential, or farming, but more of your quasi ranching, hunting. Good conversation. My dad is on the appraisal review board in the county that he lives in, and he was mentioning it in the other video I was talking about. People come in from the big cities, people come in that aren't in that area, and the land to them looks cheap. The land to them is like, oh my gosh, this is, $5,000 an acre, right? $10,000 an acre. That's so cheap. Of course, I should just pay that. Well, because they're not familiar with the actual land values, because they're not familiar with that area, and then what happens is they end up paying way above market value, and then everybody else who's been living there 10, 15, 20, 30 years, several generations, they're like, oh my gosh, I paid $200 an acre for this or $1,000 an acre. Why are my taxes going up? Well, that's because somebody from Dallas, Houston, or out of town came in and way overpaid for their big piece of land. And then what that did is every other piece of land that's similar in the county, all of a sudden their taxes and their appraisals went up. So it's super important to really have a good, clear understanding of what the market rates and the property values are. Let's talk about utilities. So something for any of us who live in a big city or a relatively suburban, we just sort of take it for granted that you flip the switch, the light, you have electricity, you flush the commode, water and waste goes where it wants to, you turn on the faucet, you've got water. Well, when you're dealing with land and ranch, you really have to think through and be sure that you understand where that utilities are coming from. Do you have natural gas available? Or are you going to have to use propane and propane storage? Do you have electricity reasonably available? Do you have a rural water supply? Or are you going to have to dig a well? Does the place have access to sewer at the local county road? Or are you going to have to build in a septic system? Now, if it doesn't have these things, that's not the end of the world. People all over have put in septic tanks, dug wells, used propane, you name it. However, you want to be sure that you're working with your lender and your agent, working with me, to be sure that all those costs are put into the estimate and put into the loan, and so that you're not putting down a bunch of cash to make those. Now, one utility that most people don't think about until it's too late is internet, cell phone service. And it can be a real bugaboo, right? Everybody wants to get out of the country and go, but if you're planning on, during this COVID, during these quarantines, being able to use this as a place where you can work from home, well, you need to be sure that you've got the right kind of internet or the internet access to make that happen. If you're thinking about having a large enough place where you're going to have a large family gathering for Thanksgiving, those kids, those grandkids, those people who come, who are maybe you're retired, they're not retired, they're going to need access to cell phones, internet, things like that to be able to maintain their work or maintain their life. So the electricity and the rest of those things people usually think about, most people forget to think about what about internet or what about cellular or combination of communications. Deed restrictions. Now this is number 8, deed restrictions. So deed restrictions are like a double-edged sword. Deed restrictions are things that either within that county, within that area that says, okay, and this is a legal binding deed restriction, you can't have turkey farms, or you can't have mobile homes, or you can't have poultry processing plants or pig processing plants, whatever the restriction. You can't subdivide. That's another big one. Well, it's good to know, and you absolutely have to understand what those deed restrictions are on the land, not only for you, but for your neighbor. So this story, I've seen it, and I've seen it play out time and time again. Somebody comes in from big city, they find this great place that's 10, 20 acres, just outside of town, really convenient, but they feel like they're all alone. They've got all the utilities, and they, invest a lot of money, put it in a barn, fences, everything. And then, the guy next door buys a 10-acre spot and decides, what he wants to do is he wants to turn that into a commercial property, and he wants to park a bunch of 18-wheelers and trailers on there and have it as a salvage yard. And he comes in and, this is an absolutely real world example, comes in and puts in a big commercial fence, and then all of a sudden this beautiful place that they worked on for years is sitting right next door to an eyesore. And if you can imagine, maybe somebody comes in and they do the same thing with a turkey processing plant or a pig farm, or they subdivide it up and turn it into an RV park or a trailer park. So deed restrictions, both understanding what restrictions you have on you, what you can do, but also having an understanding of what people can or can't do to the properties around you is super important. Tax exemptions. Okay, we're going to talk about ag exemptions. I could do a whole 15, 20, 30-minute video on ag exemptions, and I will. Please put in the comments down there, or if that's a follow-up, if that's what you want to talk about, ag exemptions. I'm just going to hit the highlights. The ag exemptions are controlled at 2 levels. One, there's the state guidelines, but then each county sort of has their own little variants to it. Okay, so you have to understand both the state and the county. Number 2 that you need to know is it saves you a lot of money. You're going to want to have an ag exemption. Third is the size and the property use drive whether that ag exemption. So we talked about the size and we talked about the property use and putting out that plan. Well, now you're seeing how some of those are coming in together when it talks about ag exemptions. The last thing is it takes 5 years, okay, of applying to get the ag exempt. Now, if you buy a piece of land that already has an ag exemption, then you can be grandfathered in, but you have to maintain that application. You have to maintain the documentation and submit it to maintain it so that you don't lose it, and then have to reapply and take that 5 years again. I had a real world case where someone bought an ag exemption, planned on maintaining it, got the loan. They were not working with people who deal with ag loans. I tried to advise them to use a different one. And then all of a sudden, just before closing, they started looking into the ag exemption, and then they piled in a whole bunch more of documentation, affidavits, and they tried to get a bunch more money just in case they lost that ag exemption, right? And they didn't maintain it. Then the bank wanted to have a lot more money in escrow in case they did, so that way they could pay the taxes off on it if they lost that ag exemption. So working with someone who knows and understands ag exemptions from a lender perspective is super important. Knowing and understanding the tax implication and knowing and understanding the rules can save you a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of heartache. Environmental. So it is not environmental concerns. First of all, there's environmental regulations, EPA, but what I really want to hit at is it is not uncommon to have these lands in the past where they just dug a hole and buried trash, or they have underground fuel tanks, or they had some sort of chemicals there. So you're really going to want to, and there's a whole form and there's a whole agreement within the contract that gives you the right to do environmental inspections and to make sure that you're protected. But what you don't want to do is not have an understanding or not have an appreciation of the environmental implications if you buy and you have something that's there and you didn't inspect or protect yourself. So it's a big deal, and it can end up costing you a lot of money. All right, the last one, and I'm just going to touch it just very, very high level, and it goes back to size, it goes back to the purpose, and it goes back to value, and it goes back to easements, and that's mineral rights. And I'm going to lump in there something that's been growing, a trend that's been growing in Texas land and ranch over the last, call it 10, 20 years, water rights. So if you own the surface, or if you own it, then you own basic real estate law. You own everything to the sky, and then you own everything underneath. Well, yes and no. People have a tendency to, or if there is oil or if there's natural gas, either retain those rights, or maybe they have leased or sold those rights in the past. So you need to be prepared to have this whole conversation around mineral rights. Do you own them? Do you not own them? Do they transfer? Are they leased to someone else? And who has the rights to those minerals? And then big time, water rights. There's a big old ranch, like 33,000 acres. I think they're trying to sell it for $250 million out in Milam County. And one of the biggest benefits and one of the biggest values that they have is they own the water rights. And it's significant to not only use and consume, but to export that water. And they have the permits. Now, I don't know many of you who are going to pay $250 million for a ranch or whatever and plan on exporting the water. But it's important to be sure that you investigate and make sure that you have the right. I don't want to say changing, but it's being battled out in courts all the time. So water rights, knowing and understanding what your rights are. Well, I have enjoyed this time with you today. Again, I just want to tell you, we've been helping people find their little piece of heaven here in Texas. When you're ready to go, when you're ready to move forward, just give us a call, send us that text message, send us that email, and even Pony Express. We've got your back when moving here to Texas. Thank you.